Okay, and we're live. Got some people filtering into the chat room on Discord. And hopefully we'll have some folks on YouTube's end watching and enjoying too. But for everyone who's here so far, thank you so much for coming. I'm excited to get started, and I hope that this webinar ends up being fun and helpful in some way. I might be a little bit all over the place, and that's okay. Hello, Sparrow. Hello, Sunstrike. If you have any questions, put them in the workshop tab if you're in Discord. And if you ask them on YouTube, I'll try to get to some of the questions on YouTube, but due to the nature of chat zipping by, I might miss your question. But there will be a Q&A at the end. Sparrow asks, will this still be available after the stream? Yes, the VOD of this whole webinar will be available after the stream to rewatch. Well, let's just jump into it. So first I kind of want to go through a little bit about what the purpose of this webinar is, why I wanted to do this for all of y'all. And a lot of it has to do with the multi-animator projects I've hosted and the multi-animator projects I've been in. I feel like, and all the storyboards I've done as well. I feel like perspective is one of those skills that can often be really daunting when you don't understand it or when you're just starting out. And I see especially it missing in a lot of projects that could really use it. Or not even so much that the projects could use it, but the communication between map hosts and participants and map hosts is so much smoother when perspective is understood, and when in particular this magic ingredient is understood, which is the perspective grid. This thing right here, which is the grid you often see in the background of storyboards, which is how it sets the perspective. And also how it shows where the camera is pointing. And that's what we'll get more into that as the webinar progresses. But that's what I hope everyone can get out of this webinar today, is to get some basic understanding of how to draw in perspective and some basic understanding of how to think about perspective so that you can understand the perspective grid and boards when you see it and implement it in your projects. Because it'll just make your projects all the more richer and interesting for it. These are some shots from favorite videos of mine that use perspective to create a really interesting and beautiful sense of space, or create relationships between characters by the way the camera is handled, or just give a rich sense of environment and a sense of just real prettiness to scenes. Look at this beautiful upshot, which I will put the links to all of these videos in the description so you can see where all these are from. This one in particular is from Nikahi's Hawkfrost Animatics Third Planet, which I highly recommend you see if you haven't watched it, and which we will actually be doing an examination of later in the webinar, because it's just such a good example. But here's another frame from that same animatic, where just the perspective use in it just gives this beautiful sense of the environment they're in, of what's happening. It's a beautiful dynamic shot. Or this one here from a really great short video that I like. Just look at that atmosphere. Look at that. It's gorgeous. You could just walk into that painting. And I want you all to be able to do stuff like this. And it all starts with perspective. So as we dive into this, I'm going to say I'm not the best at perspective myself. I'm really good at cheating it in many respects, and I know how to think about it, which is what I'm hoping to pass on here today. But If you take what you learn here today and you want to really do that deep dive and really get good at this, here are some books that I can recommend to you. Some of them I've used myself, some of them I'm just were recommended to me, and I'm passing on the recommendation even though I haven't used them. The one book here that I can really, really recommend is Space Drawing Perspective by Dongho Kim. I probably mispronounced their name, but the book is incredible. A lot of the inspiration for this webinar was taken from this book because he breaks down perspective in a very practical way for how you're going to want to use it as an artist. I can also recommend the Perspective Drawing Handbook. It's kind of the basic starter book for learning perspective that every art student gets. And then here are some other books that I also had recommended to me, which again, all of these will be listed in the description, so you can look them up and find them yourself later. All right. Now, one last thing to get out of the way before we dive in is a terminology thing, and also a way to think about art and drawings that's going to be really valuable as we move through this webinar, and that is the camera. So I'm going to use the word camera a lot, and when I say camera, what I'm actually referring to is this box right here, which is the stage, the frame, the part that has stuff drawn into it that then shows up on your screen when the video is finished or when the art piece is finished. When I'm talking about storyboarding, when I'm talking about perspective, I'll talk a lot about the actual physical camera, if there were a camera, pointing at the subject matter that we're taking a look at. So I did this little doodle of me with my phone. If you have a phone and it has a camera, I highly recommend after this webinar pulling it out and taking reference videos and seeing how stuff looks from different angles, from different places, and see if you can see some of the stuff we'll be talking about. But if I talk about camera, know that I'm talking about an invisible camera that is literally filming what we're seeing in my mind's eye. And yeah, I drew a little picture of Boone. He waved. Okay, so perspective. It can seem really daunting. It can also be really cool. Here's some art by Lackadaisy creator Tracy Butler, showing some cool use of perspective for this car. Or you can see it in manga and other forms outside of storyboarding and comics. This is from a favorite comic of mine, Yotsuba, where, again, perspective is everywhere, establishing this sense of space and giving these beautiful camera angles, all of which are great things I recommend reading. So we're going to talk about how to create stuff like this and how to create this grid that you see, or these kinds of grids. So when talking about perspective, the main principle that we're going to be talking about today is the idea that when things move. Oh, also, if you're, sorry, quick side note, if you're on the Discord side, it's quite possible that my audio will cut out because I have rough internet. However, the recording should still upload to YouTube just fine, so if you have a hard time on Discord, I would recommend watching on YouTube and you'll probably get a better stream quality. But if my voice at all starts to cut out on the YouTube side, please let me know. Okay, where were we? Boo. So something we can see here in these drawings is, in perspective, the nature of straight parallel lines is that when they are parallel to each other, they converge backwards into space. So, for example, we have this car here, drawn by Tracy Butler. We know if we were to see a car in real life, you know, here's a car, here's a windshield, here's the dash, here's the front of the car with the headlights and wheels. we know that the top of the car is parallel to the hood of the car to the edge of the car. Those are all parallel lines, which means they all go backwards into space, pointing at the same point backwards into space. They can all be traced back to this point. So the easiest visual representation that people love to whip out when they're talking about perspective is a railroad. Choo-choo, the train. If we have a railroad, which, you know, if you've seen a railroad, it has two parallel rails going back, you know, going however long it goes, as well as these straight slats going across it in regular intervals. If you were to stand on top of a railroad looking down it as it goes off into the distance in a straight line, it's going to look something like this. And you might have seen this sort of thing if you are standing in the middle of a road, looking at a straight road going off into space, is you can see this kind of triangle shape that is created by parallel lines going back into space. But if we were to put, and I see here I put these benches next to it, if you were to put something else that's parallel into next to the railroad, all of its lines would go back in the same direction. So if we had these benches, all the lines in the benches that are parallel go back towards the same point. So if you've seen this, then the question is, how do you do this? How do you make this, and in what shape or form to get what you want in your mind's eye to look the way that you want it? And that starts with understanding the two pieces of perspective, which is the horizon line, this line right here. This is the horizon line. And this right here, which is called the vanishing point. So we're going to start with talking about what is the horizon line. So the horizon line, I'm going to bump over here a little bit. The horizon line is a line that's going to bisect what you see on the frame. It's also called the horizon line. Or, sorry, it's also called the horizon line. It's also called the eye level. Sometimes the horizon line can be described as the edge of the earth that you can kind of see, except it really isn't. But what it is the line of the edge of the earth as viewed from where the camera is. So if I were standing with my camera, so here's the camera, and I'm looking out towards the distance. If I traced a line directly across where my eyeball is, or to be more accurate, since we're going with the camera option, so this is what the camera is filming. If we traced a line out to infinity that cuts right through where the camera lens is, aka the eye level of the camera, that line is the horizon line. So if this character were looking this way in perspective, with the little phone. Then the horizon line would be somewhere out in the infinite over this ways. Now, the horizon line changes depending on how high the camera is, how high the eye level is. And that often relates to the frame of what we're seeing on screen. Is if we are just staring straight out, then the shorter we are, so like if this person was sitting down to film this, so low to the ground, then the horizon line would be lower than it would if they were standing, or if they were up in the air. And sometimes, a lot of times, the horizon line is actually going to be way off screen where you don't even see it. If you're having a character that's really high up, then the horizon line is actually going to be above them. Or not above them, but it's going to be above the frame because the person is much higher than the frame looking down. And I took a video to explain this a little bit better so you can see what I mean when this is happening with the horizon line. So this is a video of my basement. Surprise. Right now, you can see here, right now this is me. I am standing up filming this in front of a table. So zooming back in. I tilt the camera down to look down at the table because I'm standing in front of it. If we go back up, right here, here is the eye level. Now, how do we know this is where the eye level is? It's because everything that is pointing the same direction as my camera is pointing in these directions. I marked some of the edges here so you can see where they're pointing. They're all pointing to that point right there. Because this box thing on the ceiling, this doorway, this doorway, those are all pointing the same direction that the camera is, which means they all converge at this point, which means that this is where the eye level is. So if this character were drawn a little bit more accurately, this is where they'd be standing, where the horizon line meets the camera. So now if the camera goes down, so here you can see I tilted the character and the camera to be looking down. Where is the horizon line? It's actually up there because it was already there. You can see how it crosses that vague area on the paintings? Because the camera itself hasn't been lowered in space, you know, I'm not holding the camera down here, I'm holding it in the same relative area, I just tipped it. Same as my head is at the same height, I just looked down. That means the horizon line stays up where it was, at the level of my head. So that means all of these things still point to the exact same spot on the horizon line. So all of these lines are still converging in that same direction. Now, if I were to lower the horizon line, as in lower myself, so here I sat down at the table, there I am sitting. Now the horizon line is right there, which is actually higher than it was here, or sorry, than it was here within the actual frame. You can see there's like this one, it's about exactly in the middle. And this one, it's a little bit higher. That's because while I was filming this, I accidentally tilted it a little bit upwards. But where it's actually lower from is up here. Our horizon line is still up here from earlier, even because it went off frame. And that's where it went when we sat down. So now if you see these same lines as before, you can see how this squished when we sat down. Those same places that we traced over before, these same parallel lines going the same direction, they all now go to there. And you can see because the horizon line is lower, this triangle created right here by these lines is much wider than it was right here, where that triangle went way up. So when you want to make things to look flatter, you're going to lower the horizon line. Well, when I say things, I mean the ground. The closer you are to the ground, the more squished that triangle shape is going to get, which is evidenced even further if we move the camera even farther down. And this time I lowered it down to where the camera was sitting on the table. So here's what I was doing in real life. And now, if you can see, the horizon line actually goes through all of these boxes and books. And so now all of these lines point to the middle, right there. So now between all of these horizon lines, this one is here, this one is here, and the other one was way up there. So when you're talking about horizon line, and you're also talking about the eye level of the camera, which the camera either represents you and something that you are looking at, or it can represent your audience and what they're looking at, or it can represent a character and what the character is looking at. So when you're drawing something, you can ask, who is the camera right now? Who is actually seeing what's happening? Because that will help determine where you want the horizon line to go. So are there any questions about the horizon line specifically real quick before we move on to the vanishing point? Oh, I see Tumble. Tumble had a question. One thing I struggle with is how far apart to make the lines in the perspective grid. How does one decide that? It really depends on it depends on what you want to draw. Because we talked about, the horizon line, as the horizon line lowers, things connecting to it are going to be more squished, if this is our frame. And if the horizon line is higher, then something that is the same width here is going to be like this here. So the short answer is it depends how far apart. Depends on how high the horizon line is. But also, when you're just putting in a perspective grid to work on top of, they can really be any width. For example, if I go back here, this perspective grid on top of this image, this was created using a perspective tool, which is also going to be linked in the description because it's a very useful tool. And you can see here, there's lines going all over the place. And so that way it can be used to reference whatever it is that you want to draw at any width at any line. The other short answer to that is it's something you get a feel for over time and over practice. And especially if you do draw overs with reference. I highly, highly recommend taking reference photos and drawing over them to determine the perspective and kind of get a feel for how wide things are, how far apart the parallel lines are, and to practice that sort of thing. Tumble also asked, how do you determine how tall the camera should be if the camera is your character's eyes? Do you take some photos of what you think the character's height is? Yeah, 100%. If it's a character who you're basing off of yourself or someone like you, if they're the same age, etc., then you can just take photos with holding your camera at your head height. But if you're going to be drawing something from a cat's perspective, then get down on the ground and take a reference photo of where a cat's head would be, like a foot off the ground. Because a cat's going to have a way lower horizon line. They are so much closer to the ground than we are. And if you're doing something with a very tall character, get a chair. Stand on a chair and take photos from a chair. Now there is mathy things you can do. I will mention this. Perspective is something that is really easy to approximate once you know what you're looking for, but it is also something that can be incredibly precise with math. And if you can learn how to do it with math, you will be all-powerful, truly a god. So I recommend learning how to do it with math. And if you learn to do it with math, you would be able to do things like, say, this camera is 6 feet tall, which is going to make everything in perspective be these exact heights. And you could actually determine the heights from the perspective, which is incredibly powerful. And I am not at that level myself. But there are many great resources, there are many great books, and it is something that is very easy, well, not easy, but is very available to learn. And I highly empower you all to go and learn it after this webinar. So, and I think there was one other question. How do you make horizon lines clear with stuff like trees where they aren't square or rectangle? We will get to that. We will get to how you put organic shapes into perspective later on in the webinar. So moving back forward then, now we're going to talk about the other half, which is the, where was I? Oh, here we go. Which is the vanishing point. So we talked about the horizon line. The horizon line is the eye level. It's how tall your head is, or how tall the camera is in relation to everything else around it. That's how you determine the horizon line. The other part of that is the vanishing point, which is the line that everything flows towards when they are parallel. All the parallel lines move towards this one single point. So what is the vanishing point? If the horizon line is eye level, then the vanishing point is eye laser pointer. And I'll try and show you what I mean. So imagine a laser pointer. When you have a laser pointer, you don't actually see that line. You just see the dot, right? That you're making your little cat chase around. That dot is in a straight, perfect line from the laser pointer. If your eyeball were a laser pointer. And if there was a straight line coming out from your eyeball, where your eyeball is pointing would cast a single point. That would be the exact point of what you were looking at. Just that straight line from the eyeball out like a laser pointer. That point stretching out from your eyeball is the vanishing point. That's all it is. Except the eyeball that exists looking at that single vanishing point is the face of the object. So if we had a box, you know, if you have a six-sided die with 6 faces, imagine each of those faces having an eyeball on it, and each of those eyeballs has a laser pointer coming out of it. In perspective, depending on how accurate you want the perspective to be, any lines parallel on the box to any of the directions those eyeballs are pointing will flow in the direction of the end of that laser pointer. So if we were to draw this box with all the eyeball faces in perspective, this line, this line, this line, and the invisible line right here in the back are all going to flow towards this laser pointer point, this vanishing point, which wherever this face is pointing, wherever the eyeball itself is pointing. And then depending on how many other vanishing points you put into the piece, these, if you wanted to have this face going back into perspective, it would go towards that one. If you wanted this face going back into perspective, then that means this line, this line, this line, and this invisible line on the back would all be going towards that vanishing point. And if this face is heading backwards in perspective, that means this line, this line, this line, all of the ones that are parallel to like the direction that this face is pointing, parallel to the laser pointer line, are going to be heading towards that vanishing point in that direction. So we're going to take a look at how this looks in practice. So we got a little 1-point perspective grid here that I threw up the other day. Let's put in a box. So here is one face of the box, which means that face is pointing towards that vanishing point. And I'm saying it's pointing at that vanishing point because I say so. I'm saying this box points towards this vanishing point. So the edges that are parallel to that laser pointer, if that's the eyeball, and if the eyeball is looking in that direction, all of these lines I can trace along the lines of the perspective grid to put it into perspective. Ta-da! Box in perspective. Now if I put that box up here, but it's pointing at the same place, the same single point, same deal. I trace these lines back. Box in perspective. So anything that is a box is going to be really easy to pull back in perspective because there are a lot of parallel lines on a box. You've got all of these beautiful edges and they all point in a single direction, so therefore they're all going to be pulled back to point at the same vanishing point. But someone asked, what about non-boxes? Because lots of things in the world are boxes. Buildings are boxes, tables are boxes, books are boxes. But there's lots of things that aren't boxes. So what do you do for not boxes? Let's say you want to put in a can of soda, which is a cylinder. So we've got a cylinder right here. We've seen cylinders before. A cylinder involves one side is a circle, the other side is a circle, and then there's a straight line in between them. Now these two straight lines look familiar. Those look familiar to the edges of a box. They are parallel, which means that if this top of the can had an eyeball doing the little laser pointer, that these two lines would also point backwards in perspective, which would make it very useful to do something like a can lying on its side. So let's draw in a circle here, trace a line back, make a smaller circle, trace the line back. Which, if you're wondering how small to make that other circle, start with tracing the lines back. So if I trace these lines back following the same angle as these lines here in the perspective grid, then I can see the other side has to fit between those two lines. And there is our sideways cylinder. But what if the can's standing up? Well, something funny happens when the closer you approach the horizon line up or down when you're drawing things. And you can see it here in this box. This shape, we know in our minds, is a square like this, but it's been squished like that. The closer things get to the horizon line, the squishier they're going to be, the narrower they're going to be. And then the farther they are, the wider they're going to be, the more of the top of it or the bottom of it we'll actually see. The bottom of it being, of course, if it is above the horizon line. Excuse me. The same thing happens with circles. And a circle, when the closer it gets to the horizon line, is going to squish into an ellipse. So if we start with a circle up here, the closer it gets to the horizon line, the squishier it's going to get until it's like flat, just the top of the soda can. And then it's going to unsquish to look at the top of the soda can now instead. So just taking a circle, you can just squish it to then put it into perspective. And there are mathier ways to make it curve in a very specific way to really put into perspective. Not important for our purposes here today, but you can learn it. It will make you a god. Carrying on. I'm promising a lot of godhood with these perspective powers, but I promise having these powers of understanding perspective will really up your art game to an absurd degree. Quick question from the Discord. Tumble says, so single point is really when everything is facing the same way or going the same direction, like if you have several objects placed against a wall? Exactly! All of the parallel lines go towards the same point. So if you have a bunch of objects in a line against the same wall, and they're all flush against they're all pointing towards the wall, like if you lined up books on a bookcase, all those books are parallel. Their lines are parallel to each other. They will go back toward the same point. And Tumble continued, I guess shoving your characters in a box can help them be drawn in perspective, which is exactly where we were going to. The exact correct way to put organic shapes or non-box shapes into perspective is to turn them into boxes. So let's look at our box here. Let's look at our circle here. You know what fits perfectly inside of a square? A circle. Which means all of these faces could be a circle in perspective, touching each edge of the box. So if you want to draw your up and down soda can, one way to do it would be to draw a box in perspective and then draw a squished ellipse, a squished circle, touching each of the edges of that box, and then carry those edges down. And if we draw the rest of the box, it helps. If we draw the see-through backside. And then draw another circle that again touches all of the edges of the box the way that a circle would. And then if you remove, ta-da, soda can in perspective. So that's how you put a cylinder into perspective, is really it's drawing a circle. And the nice thing too is sometimes you don't even have to draw the box in, because if you look here at this perspective grid, it already has boxes drawn into it. So you could draw a circle like this. Although this would make, because this is the ground plane, it would make a better bottom circle. So whoop. So that's how you put a cylinder into perspective. And you know what are cylinders in perspective? Trees. Trees are cylinders. Just a really tall cylinder. And if you have the tree bending around, then that's just multiple cylinders. Which then brings the question. Well, I'll get to the question. But real quick, what if it's not a tree? What if it's not a cylinder? What if it's something like a rock and it's a really funky shape? Let's erase some of these cylinders. We don't need them. And this box is lovely, but we don't need it. If you have a really funky shape, let's say a rock that's shaped kind of like the Pride rock thing. If you're doing something for like warrior cats and you have that big rock that Blue Star stands in, and it's shaped something like this, If you know what it looks like in silhouette, you can put it into perspective. Which is to say, if you were to draw a box, what you would want to do to put other organic shapes in, put them into a box, as in give them faces, cut them into pieces. This is a trick that I learned in art school. If we have this rock and we were to put it into this box, like so, where it's touching on this ground square, if this is the bottom of the box, then the rock, where it touches it, where it meets the ground, is going to make a shape. Like if you were to take the rock, dip it in ink, and stamp it down on a piece of paper, it would make a shape, which is the shape of the bottom of the rock. Which, if we can draw that shape into a square, that means we can approximate that shape into that square. And then, if you were to take pieces of the rock, so you're like, okay, well, there's this big rock, but then there's a smaller rock sitting on top of it like that. Then you can go to the place in the box where that rock sits and draw that rock in. And then you can carry those lines up to where the rock is. And you can do this from any angle. You can go at it from bisecting it this way. You know, if you were to cut the rock into pieces with a knife lengthwise, like chopping a carrot, and if you trace the outline of each of those carrot slices of it, going back into space and then putting them into like flat planes moving backwards along these lines, and you put into perspective that way. Now, putting organic shapes into perspective, three-dimensional shape, can still be really tricky, especially if the organic shape you're trying to put into space is something like a human, which, real quick note, you know what a human is? It's a box. We are all just boxes in perspective. Boxes and cylinders. But still, it can be really tricky, which is why I recommend, above all, the best way to put organic things into perspective is to get photo reference and to trace over them. Take your own photo reference, though. That way, you're not stealing, you're just arting. But seriously, take photos. If you want photo reference for an environment, for a warrior cats project, go out and take photos at a cat's eye level of the things you want to put into perspective. Or take photos at the camera angle that you want your shots to be in, and then draw the things in perspective. Okay, question from YouTube. Bugsy asks, how does perspective work with arches? Good question. Works exactly the same way. Because an arch is both half of a cylinder and a box. So if we erase our beautiful bisected rock there, Tumble said in Discord, the painful experience of drawing things with no easy IRL equivalent. I feel you, and that's when putting things in boxes really helps. Or taking similar shapes in real life and then putting them into perspective. Like if you want to draw a cool oblong spaceship, go find an oblong grapefruit and take a photo of it and then put that into perspective and then draw the ship on top of it. Or if you want to draw a weird animal that doesn't exist, go get some clay, make a little model, take photos of it. Hydration. So yes, sorry, I got distracted from your question. Arches. You have a box. There's our plane. It's pointing that direction. So we draw the shape of our arch and how it's cut out. And that's still just a box, which means we can trace it backwards into perspective along those lines. And we know that this right here is the back end of the arch, it's the back end of the box. So we pull that over with a straight line there, which means this line is also where the edge of that arch ends on the inside, because it can only be as thick as it actually is. So then you draw a line in perspective along there, and then you carry that straight line up and curve it to meet the other edge. Pa-pow! Arch. Someone in the Discord asked, and I say someone because I apologize, but the way the Discord apps work, sometimes it hides people's names from me. I don't know why. So I just see S ... asks, do you have any tips when it comes to using a fisheye lens perspective? We will actually be getting to that. The tip is learn math, but we'll be getting to that, or at least how to fake it. So now the question that no one has asked relative to all of this is what happens if objects are not parallel to each other? I'm going to duplicate this frame here so that we can get rid of almost all of this. So let's say, well, we're just going to get rid of all of it. If you have, for example, a stack of books is often tidy and all the books are parallel to each other, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes the books are all in disarray, especially if you're drawing an environment that has like a bunch of scattered books everywhere. So let's say this book is facing this way, and you want to draw a book sitting on top of it that's pointing another direction. Well, if any object is pointing in any direction, that means it has an eyeball pointing in that direction, which means a new vanishing point. So I put a vanishing point there, and I can draw some parallel lines here and here. We're going to trace those back into perspective. And now that book is sitting kitty corner to the other. Now something interesting happens when we do this, when you turn an object in space. Because you can add as many vanishing points to the horizon line as there are laser pointer eyeballs. For however many things exist in the space, new vanishing points can be added. It just depends on like how many laser pointers are happening, how many faces, how many parallel lines are pointing in different directions. Because every which way they point, they will go somewhere. Which brings up an interesting point. With this book right here that we drew, this low box, these lines went backwards into space, pointing towards this vanishing point. But this line right here is perfectly horizontal. And that's because we were drawing in one point perspective. We were only worried about the lines that were parallel to this point, which is what happens if you're standing in a room and everything is parallel to you going back into space. So like the railroad or standing on a road, most things are going to be pointing the same direction because cars along a road are also going to be pointing the same direction on a road. No car is spinning around wildly in the middle of the street. They're all driving in straight lines. But in other contexts, things will be pointing in lots of different directions. So if you have something that is not facing you directly, you notice these lines go backwards into space towards this point because this face points at it, this face right here of the book. But there's also now this face of the book is pointing somewhere. Tumble suggests, it just hit me that things like Minecraft are fantastic for taking reference images because in Minecraft everything is a box. 100%. Go into Minecraft and build perspective grids in Minecraft by just using different colored blocks. And then take screenshots. Use that for your art. Use it as reference for environments. Build environments in Minecraft. It's a freaking amazing tool. So anyway, this face is now pointing somewhere that isn't directly at the camera. It's no longer parallel to the camera, so it needs its own vanishing point for these parallel lines, which I kind of did it instinctively. You can see here I made them tilt instead of being straight across. And if we trace them back, boop, 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 it looks like they vaguely go to this point right here. And we can see here, I even drew this a little bit wrong. It actually needs to be right there. Boop. So now when you have an object where the face is not facing the camera, then it's going to be in 2-point perspective, where we're going to see the lines go to there, and we're going to see the other lines going to there. And this point is still the point referencing this specific box and anything else that's parallel to it. Sorry, I was just checking my overview to see where we were going. Now, what happens if we are looking down at something and it's both not facing the same direction we are, but it's also not facing the same direction that our body is by standing straight up and down against the ground? Or even if it is, what if we're really like high up looking down at it? So for example, if we put in a box that is if we want to draw a box that's floating in space, now we have all of these different faces going in all sorts of different directions. Each of these parallel lines, these ones, and now these ones are all going to have a point. And that, when you need to do all 3 edges, that's called 3-point perspective. And it shows up most often when you're looking really high up at something, or you're looking down at something, or if you want to have something floating in perspective like this. But even then, you can eyeball it. I just eyeballed it, and that looks pretty good. Let's see. Cool Fox asked on YouTube, when you make a new vanishing point for adding a second object, how do you know where to put the vanishing point? Great question. A lot of it is something that the more you practice, you will get a feel for it. But what I usually do is I will draw vaguely what I want. So I'm like, okay, I want an open book sitting like this, you know, which is 2 cylinders open. It's an open book. I will draw vaguely what I want, and then I will find the parallel lines happening, and I will trace out a really far line for them. So I know that, like, this book binding is parallel to the edge of the book, so I'm going to trace that line out to cross the horizon line at the same point. And you see, I eyeballed that pretty good. I also know that the top of this book is going to cross the horizon line at the same point as the bottom of it. So I can then trace this out to see where it crosses over on the horizon line, which is going to be about, if we extend the horizon line, it looks like it's going to be about somewhere over here, which means that my perspective on these lines is a little bit inaccurate. So now I can go in with the new vanishing point, and I can clean this up to be a bit more accurate. So usually that's my process when I'm drawing things in perspective, is draw the thing vaguely and then see which directions I drew it to point and then make them all match. It is something that you get to intuitively have more of a feel for the more you draw it. So for now, I would recommend, rather than putting in an object and then figuring out where the vanishing points are, as you're practicing and learning, start with the vanishing point, put a vanishing point somewhere, and then trace the vanishing point out. You know, and if it's 2-point perspective, put that over here. You know, trace the vanishing points out and then draw something from those vanishing points to see what it looks like, see what it feels like. So now I'm going to show you some photo reference and show you kind of how to draw over photo reference to see what I'm talking about and figuring out where are vanishing points and where are horizon lines. So back to the basement. We have this photo here of all these different objects on a table, which would be great if I were setting up a set for, like, if I was drawing an image of a bunch of characters sitting at a table reading. You know, I could have a character there, I could have a character there, you know, reading books, having a party, etc. So this, we see a lot of straight lines here. We see a lot of parallel lines. We also see a lot of lines going in different directions. So first off, let's figure out where the horizon line is for this camera that's pointed down at this table. Which, how do we know that the camera is pointed down at the table? It's because we see the camera from this, we see the frame, we see the image from this angle. We kind of intuitively know somewhere there is a table and there is a camera up here looking down at it. There's our little phone camera. Boop, 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 boop. It's somewhere floating above the table, being cool. So this angle also, if the camera's floating above the table, this camera angle kind of implies someone standing next to the table, looking down these characters. Maybe it's one of their friends watching these two read. Or maybe it's the audience just watching these two read from a perspective of floating over them, knowing things that they don't know. Kind of gives a God's eye sort of perspective to it. Which we will talk more about what different camera angles mean shortly. But let's trace over this image and see if we can figure out where all of these objects are going. So first off, let's use the table. The table is probably the biggest thing that we can see moving into space. So we're going to trace a line along the edge of that table, which most of the time your horizon line and vanishing points are going to be really far off the edge of your frame. So see, we're doing whoop, boop, 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 really going far out. There we go. There's our first vanishing point, which means our horizon line, boom, right there. So now we're going to take a different color and we're going to trace some of these other objects. So we got this soda box. We're going to trace it right up to there. Yes, the line tool is wonderful. And if we trace this other soda box to that other point, to the same point right there, it's already in perspective because it's a camera and it's very cool. S on Discord says, never in a million years did I think perspective would actually make sense. This is why I wanted to do this, because I feel like perspective at its root is very, very simple. It's just converging lines. It's all around us. We see it every single day, and you just need that penny to drop for it to make sense, to then be able to recreate it. So now this box is actually in 2-point perspective because these lines are not straight up and parallel to us. Or not parallel, sorry, I keep using parallel in different contexts than the one I ought to use it. It's not facing the same direction that the camera is facing. So we're going to trace that up there. And it looks like this box is parallel, vaguely, to the table. So those lines all go in the same direction too. But this box isn't. So let's trace the line here. That's going to go there. And that one is going to go there. And this edge is going to go... This one's really far. We got to make the horizon line wider. That one is way over here. So if you are really figuring out precise perspective, your drawings will often look like this, which is why I recommend working on a large canvas that stretches outside of what you want your finished piece to be. Or if you're drawing with physical tools, when I was in drawing school, I would have my piece of paper, and then I would have tracing paper, which is something you find at art stores, and I would have big sheets of tracing paper that go over what I'm drawing, where I would then do all of this perspective doodling stuff, because then I could lift up the tracing paper and the image would still be fine. And the equivalent of that in digital is to just have another layer. See, I have all these layers to draw the perspective on top of, so I can figure out the perspective of my piece and then work from there without drawing and messing things up. We'll trace one more thing back into perspective, because I want to trace this right here. This one, I intentionally tilted this pack of cards a specific way in order to make this 3-point. Let's grab a dark green and a new layer for it. So first off, pack of cards. It's parallel to this box, and it looks like this box. They're all still facing vaguely the same way, so it follows the same lines up to that vanishing point. Now these lines right here and these lines right here are going to go in a different direction than we've seen so far. So the thing is about the eye level, about the horizon line, is it gathers all of the vanishing points that are also facing the same way in space. So if we are a person holding a camera, then we are also a box. We are a person inside of a box. And everything that is pointing straight up and down, the way that we are standing, is going to land on this horizon line. But if it's pointing a different direction, it's now going to face a different horizon line. And that's complicated, and 3-point perspective is hard. So I hope that this at least puts an idea in your head, because this is by far going to be the weirdest thing we're going to trace today. And actually, I apologize. Looking at this box, it's really small, which is going to make it really hard to trace it properly in the right directions. Suffice to say, these lines are going somewhere back here. And these lines, the tilted lines of the box from the little side, are going in another direction completely. So I think it's actually somewhere around here. And there's some vanishing point that a ways-ish where that's pointing. Now, if I were drawing this, if I wanted to draw something like this at this camera angle for an environment that I'm doing for a background or a storyboard, I would take this photo and I wouldn't even bother putting in the perspective lines. I would trace over the objects as is. Because I don't have to figure out the perspective of this playing card box. It's right there. It's already in perspective. I just have to trace it. And then I can go, oh look, there's a table. Boop. A table with objects. Incredible. And that's all you need for a storyboard. For when you're making something more precise with when you want it to very specifically be a certain way, that's when you got to whip out the math, and that's when you got to learn more about 3-point perspective that I'm going to talk about. So there's one other thing, a fun little tip when it comes to putting multiple objects in perspective. I'm going to illustrate with this family photo. where I drew over my family's faces for their privacy. And this is all of us at the beach, which is a great picture to figure out perspective on because we have a literal horizon line, as in it's the horizon. Which I don't know why the horizon line falls at the same point as the eye level. I think it has something to do with the way our eyeballs work and the fact that like the Earth is a curve. I'm not sure. But suffice it to say, the horizon line is the same as the eye level. Now, I want to show you something cool. When you have a horizon line, anything that crosses the horizon line crosses it at the same height as something that is the same height that it is. So for example, if you look here, this is my dad. My dad is this tall in the frame. This is my brother. He is that tall in the frame, which looks like, but they are both in reality about the same height. And my brother, the horizon line crosses him right at the neck, right there. And look where it crosses my dad, who is the same height. Also at the neck. Over here, the horizon line crosses my sister-in-law at the eyeballs. If I wanted to draw someone in the foreground very quickly who was the exact same height as my sister-in-law, I would know exactly how big to make them, because if I draw a stick figure the same height as her with eyeballs, oops, drew it on the same layer, let me grab that. If we make it much bigger, so this one is standing closer to the camera, I know for a fact, because I know it's the same height as that character, that it's going to cross the horizon line right there at the eyeballs. So no matter how big it is, I could also like take her and put her really tiny in the background. Give her some eyes. I can make her teeny tiny itty bitty. I can make her actually standing. I'm going to move this one over here to where they're standing in front of my other brother. Boop. If I decided, oh, I really want this character in the next scene to have run over and stood next to this one in the background, which is my mom. If I wanted her to run and stand next to my mom in the background, I could shrink her down to be the same height, to be at the same space right next to my mom, and I would know that I would need her, if I wanted her to be the correct height, her eyeballs would be crossing the horizon line. It works for absolutely everything. Everything that is the same height. So for example, if I wanted to put something else into the picture that was the same height as my dad, it would need to cross the horizon line at the neck. If I wanted to put something in that that's the same height as my mom's crosses right underneath the horizon line. So if I were to draw my mom into the foreground, she would be right about here. Maybe a little bit taller. That looks wrong for how tall my mom is. But yeah, everything that is the same height crosses the horizon line at the same place. So if you are doing a crowd of cats for a warrior cat scene, and the horizon line is down here because they are cats, and you draw one cat sitting here like this, and they're looking up at like a cat on top of the great rock giving a speech. If I want to draw a cat closer to the great rock that is the same vague height as this cat, which most cats would be around the same size, then it would cross at this part of the body. So I could draw it like this. And now those two cats are perfectly in perspective. They are the same height. And if I wanted a character in the foreground, Same deal. Cross at the same point of the body. Now, another trick when you're working with this, just to cross-reference, if you can't see the horizon line to gauge, if the horizon line is like way off the screen, if we are, for example, we have a shot like this, where there's a character in the foreground, and there's a character behind them. And if we know these two characters are the same height, but it's for whatever reason we aren't quite sure what height they should be. Oh yeah, sorry about the cough. Then you can also, if you can determine where the vanishing point is between them, let's say it's right here and the horizon line is right there. I mean, using the trick, we can already tell they are in the correct perspective because it crosses them at the same point on the forehead. But another way you can check is, remember, everything is a box. Including cat heads. Which means this point on the top of the head and this point, we can draw a straight line between them to the vanishing point. And that tells us that they are the exact same height. Because it's like the box where obviously this edge and this edge are the same height. Now the reverse of this is that if you see a scene with someone else that someone else has drawn and it looks slightly off, it's often because sometimes people get the perspective a little bit off. For example, if I have two characters and if I know Lionheart is sitting in on this scene and Tiger Star is also sitting in on this scene, and here's Lionheart, and he's a big, buff, burly dude. And then I drew in Tiger Star also being a big, buff, burly dude in the foreground. It doesn't look quite right, does it? And that's because while this is crossing Lionheart at the base, it's crossing Tiger Star at the middle. So it actually makes it look like Tiger Star is really tiny and is like a baby kit sitting next to Lionheart. So if we wanted him to feel the same size as Lionheart, we would need to move him up to be crossing the horizon line at the same place. Let's see, where are we now? So that's the fun trick with the horizon line. I use that all the time in my storyboards, especially when I'm arranging characters in a scene. And even the more you practice it, the more you'll start to get a general sense that even without the specific horizon line, you can kind of get a sense of the relationship between characters to see where you want them to fall in a specific scene. So now let me go to my whiteboard thing. Here we go. Oh wait, I don't need to go there quite yet. I lost track of where we are in my document. Thanks for your patience. Talked about the different types of perspective. So we talked a little bit about how putting things into perspective will create 1 point or 2 point or 3 point, depending on how many vanishing points we're tracing out from a specific object. But it can go really wild. such as with fisheye perspective. And what's actually happening with fisheye perspective is it's on the curve of a sphere. So, you know, a fisheye perspective box might look something like this, you know. What's happening is this is actually, if this is our horizon line, because we're at the same eye level as this fisheye box and looking straight at it. What's actually happening is this, the straight line right here, and the straight line right here, we know in our mind, we've seen a box, we know that those are parallel lines, which means they're heading the same direction. But because of the way it's fisheye curving, it's actually heading up towards a vanishing point. Well, what's actually happening is, if remember our box with all the eyeballs? What's happening in a fisheye is that rather than the parallel faces pointing the same eyeball direction, you know, like these would then be going towards the same point in either direction. Now every single face gets its own vanishing point depending on where it's pointing. So each of these faces now is following a different vanishing point because it's casting out a different laser pointer, which then creates this weird curved effect that we know as fisheye. So if we were to trace it out, we'd be going to a vanishing point up here. We would be going to a vanishing point way somewhere out here. We'd be going to a vanishing point somewhere way out here. We would also be going down to a vanishing point somewhere down here. And we would be going inwards to a vanishing point right there. And possibly more. The fisheye perspective is either... See, this is where I'm betraying my lack of knowledge and just a general feel, a general vibe for things. Which is, the vibes say that this sort of perspective is 5-point perspective to make fisheye. And I think there's even more points of perspective. I don't even know what 4-point or 6-point are, but technically you could add even more points of perspective. It would just turn things into a sphere, I guess. That would be one to look up in a book, because I certainly do not know enough about it. But I will say, fisheye perspective does have a purpose in storyboarding. And I think I might just jump ahead and show it to you. So I'm going to show you an animation, a shot. So I storyboarded this earlier. This is a camera move where this cat runs past the camera. Let's see that again. Oh, this is this is 4-point perspective. Is it? I don't know. This is a perspective, and it's useful because if we were to remove the camera, this is actually a panorama photo that I took. And I took the panorama photo mimicking, here it is here. This is a panorama photo mimicking the actual camera move that I wanted. I wanted the cat to run from one end of the yard to the other end, and the camera would track with it. So I filmed that camera move using a panorama photo. And what that created was this wonky perspective with a curve in the middle. You can see the fence line, which is a parallel fence, curves. Let's do that with a red line so it's easier to see. Because we have two vanishing points going on here. We have the vanishing point from the start of the video. This is where the camera was originally pointing. That's where the laser pointer was pointing originally. Then the camera moved, so the laser pointer is now pointing that way, with that as the vanishing point. And then the camera moved again to where the vanishing point is over here. So if you want to make backgrounds that imply a camera move, you can actually put in multiple points of perspective to create a background that will look like a camera move when you hit play. Now you see this a lot in like old Looney Tune videos, where if you have, there'll be shots of like the top, you'll see a camera angle looking up at the top of a building. Oh, the building looks so tall. And then the camera will move downwards all the way down to show the base of the building in perspective, to show the doorway, to show, oh man, this skyscraper is so big. And in the middle of that camera move, you see the front of the building looking like this as it's zipping down, which means the overall shape that's happening, if you were to paint all of this as one background to stick behind your camera move, is the building's going to look like this. We're doing circle windows because I'm trying to move quickly for you guys. Bump. 5-point perspective. But that's just very approximated. I knew what I wanted it to look like at the start, and I knew what I wanted to look like at the end, and I kind of filled in the gaps in the middle. But using the panorama mode on your camera is a great tool for figuring out camera moves like this. For example, some that might be more relevant to our Warrior Cats stuff. I filmed this panoramic photo of a cat tower with the intention that the camera would start out here with maybe a character sitting in the cat tower looking down, and then the camera would pan down to see the angry cat sitting at the bottom. So because I filmed that camera move, now this panorama gives me the correct perspective to paint my background. I also filmed this one, which this sort of perspective and using a panorama is also really good for making something feel really tall. And I did this by putting the camera flat on the ground. This is where the camera was to start. And then I filmed a panorama just tilting the camera upwards until it saw the top of the tower. So if this were, for example, a tree, tons of trees everywhere. If you wanted to have a shot where a character was looking at a tree they were about to climb, you could go out and film a panorama of the tree. It's true, it does. S says, wow, that's incredible. The fisheye makes it even taller than if it were just a 3-point perspective. It really feels like a POV shot. Yep, because it's baking in the path your eyes would travel. Because if you were a little kitty cat looking at this, your eyes would do the camera movement. Your eyes would look at this first, and then it would travel up the tower to look at the very top thing, and at every point, that's what you would be seeing. So by putting something in this perspective, it helps it feel even more like a POV shot. And especially if you were to actually put a camera move in, it would feel totally natural. Now, if someone hasn't done a panorama shot before, usually the way that panorama shots work on your phone, if you have a phone that has panorama, is you hit start. There'll be a place to do a panorama photo in your camera app. And once you select panorama, it'll ask you to hit the button to hit go, and then it'll act like you're recording a video. And then you move the camera in the direction that you want the camera for your camera move to move. So, for example, if we jump all the way back here to this, if I wanted to film all of this as a background so that I could animate on top of this and have a consistent background for all of that, then I could do the same motions that my Rook character is doing here while I'm recording the panorama. And then once you land at the ending spot right here, you hit stop. So it's something to play around with. Play around with panorama mode. If you don't have a camera or a phone, then borrow someone's to play around with it. And if not, then take a look at old videos. Take a look at old like Looney Tunes things and see if you can trace the background that's happening on screen. So now I want to move on. Now that we know about these basics of perspective, the horizon line trick, and using panorama photos to make things feel more POV, I want to talk about now how this applies to storyboarding and what kind of perspectives you'll see in storyboarding and what those mean. S asks, is there such a thing as a reverse fisheye where the curves face the opposite way? Great question. I feel like a reverse fisheye would look the same? No. I have no idea. That's my answer. But look into it. Let us know if you discover if there is reverse fisheye. And Bugsy, how much longer do I expect the webinar to go? I would say maybe a half an hour longer. Because what I want to go through now is talk about half an hour, maybe an hour. Depends on how long it takes to talk about camera moves now. And camera angles. So there are a lot of different camera angles that exist if you are making a video. There are so many camera angles. There's an infinite number of camera angles. However, there's only really a handful that I use and go to again and again and again. And these are for like just across the board general use. When I'm filming or storyboarding a video like Next Up Forever. And we're going to take a look at some of those as represented in this board here by Nikahi, Hawkfrost's Third Planet, which again, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. The link will be in description. It's an amazing piece of work, and we're going to analyze some of the shots and the perspective that's happening in these shots. So, this shot right here, it's the opening shot. We see Hawkfrost looking at Brambleclaw, having a good old laugh, sitting together, brothers. What perspective's happening right here? Well, there's nothing here to anchor our perspective, or is there? We know that Hawkfrost and Brambleclaw are roughly the same size. So if we were to trace the tops of their heads, and maybe their chests, we'd probably find a vanishing point at the end of that. So here, I did a rough sketch of about what the perspective grid I would put on this shot is. And we can see from here that it's a little bit of an upshot, because see, we're seeing that part of the grid. The camera is at the same vague eye level of a little bit below Brambleclaw and Hawkfrost. And what that does is it makes the audience feel a little bit shorter than they are. So it's almost like we're looking up to them. These are two good dudes. I tend to use this exact staging a lot, where you have a character in the foreground, and you have a character next to them, and you have the perspective grid doing this kind of thing roughly behind them. This is a great perspective to use for conversations between characters, between someone watching another character, because having the vanishing point over here, what this vanishing point is it's pointing vaguely the same direction as this character's eyeballs when they're looking at this other person. And since we are in their metaphorical shoes, since they are closer to the camera like this shot tells us we are looking the same direction that this character is. We are seeing what this character right here is seeing, which is why it's great for conversations, because you will flip back and forth between this shot, oops, there we go, and this shot. If you're having a conversation back and forth between two characters, this is character A is wearing a top hat, character B is wearing a party hat. Then now you flip-flop that, and we know in this shot we're seeing what in this shot we're seeing what top hat is looking at. In this shot we're seeing what party hat is looking at. And they're looking at each other because they're talking to each other. They're having conversation. And the perspective reflects that. It points the same way that they are pointing. And we can see that here to show the conversation between these two characters. It also implies relationships when you have two characters sitting next to each other. It implies connection. It implies that they are friends or they are family or that they know each other in some way. So we can see a similar thing here with them sitting next to each other. It implies relationship. And this is a great example of an establishing shot. This is another common perspective I'll use in a shot, is to have a wider shot where you can see more of the characters in it. And you can also see the top of the grid and the bottom of the grid. And these have terms in storyboarding. When you see the horizon line, everything on the grid that goes above the horizon line is called the sky plane. And everything that goes on the grid below the horizon line is called the ground plane. And that's referring to the perspective grid itself. And it can also be referring to things within that perspective grid. So if there is a ceiling, the ceiling will fall on the sky plane. But if there isn't a ceiling and it's just the sky above them, the sky plane is more there to imply where the camera is pointing. So remember we asked the question earlier of how do we know where the camera is? How do we know where the vanishing point is? And the answer is we know by what is there. The drawing on screen will tell us where the camera actually is based off of how everything is drawn in perspective. That's why perspective is so important, is it tells us where is the camera and where is it pointing. So for example, this shot, this is a one-point perspective shot. Everything is parallel and it's facing the same direction inwards into this hole, which is a great shot because we know these two characters are about to go into this window because they're looking into it and all of the lines, everything in perspective is pointing towards the interior. So you can use shots like this to use the perspective to guide the eye to imply the characters are going that direction. They're about to go inside. They're about to go somewhere. So here's another example of the shot that has these two characters in a conversation with each other. This one, if we were to trace these lines between the characters, you can actually see if the chin's right about there. Actually, the chin would be, let's do shoulders, shoulder to shoulder. If we trace this all the way back, we can actually see the horizon line is actually above them. And it's somewhere over here is the vanishing point of what is facing them. Which again, we know this is a vanishing point because if we were to bisect them, we're doing the organic shape trick. If we were to bisect that cat shape, chop them like carrots, and put that shape in a box, then that's the way that the face would be pointing. But now the interesting thing, because they are below the horizon line here, but here in the start they were above the horizon line. Here, that implies that the camera was below them. This one implies that the camera is above them. They're shorter because it has gone backwards in time, and these are kittens. We used to be shorter than them because the audience was a smaller cat than these adult cats, and now we are larger than them because the adults have become babies. So you can imply things like change of time and how old characters are based off of where the camera is and the perspective that you use. Here's another great shot over the shoulder so we can see those relationships. And there's an upshot in perspective. We can draw over this to see the lines going up to a horizon point somewhere way up there. Yes, Tumble asks, can horizon lines be diagonal or even vertical? Yes, because it has to do with the eye level. If I were to turn my body sideways or turn my camera sideways, anything that's pointing the same direction as my camera is now going to be pointing towards a vertical horizon line. And Dutch angle shots are a great example of that too. We'll see one of those later in this video. So now this one has an upshot. We'll talk a little bit about upshots and their usages on another frame. This one has an upshot because this cat just jumped in. We are currently now sitting inside of the space that cat jumped into. We are looking up at these two from what's already inside the building. So in a way, the camera is saying to these two, jump on in. We're already in here. We can see you. Dreamer Seeker asks, is there another chat happening too? Yes, there are two chats happening. There is one on YouTube, and there is one in the Boon AU Discord server, which is where I'm hosting the main portion of this seminar, or webinar. Now, someone asked about establishing shots. Here's another great example of establishing shot. Again, this one we can see the ground plane and the sky plane. Because this one, we know vaguely that all of these bushes, even though these are really organic, mushy shapes, we know they must vaguely all be about the same height because this is a tunnel. That's how tunnels work. And a tunnel is just the interior of a cylinder. So we can actually take a look at this and go, this point of this tree is following a line with that point of that tree. And those trees are all kind of generally pointing towards this area too. And this line of grass is pointing that way, which then tells us our actual vanishing point is right there. Here, example again of ground plane and sky plane. This is also another great example of the camera being so low to the ground because it is cats. If you were to put the horizon line in here, it would go about right here. And you can see this bisects these cats at about like right on the top of their legs. So that right below the hips. And if you're a cat, that's pretty low to the ground. So that means everything below this point is in between where a cat's legs would be. So that's why we see, when we take out these perspectives, that's why we see so much ground. Look at all this ground. There's so much ground here because that's what would be the most visible when we're down that low. Oh, look at these beautiful guys. I love Nikahe's boards. Again, over the shoulder shots. This time we're back. They are now adults again. We're doing the same. We are slightly shorter than them. Which, having the camera be just slightly shorter than two characters talking is pretty common. I think it feels more, it helps the audience feel like they're sitting with the characters more, unless they're shorter like they're children characters. We're just a slightly shorter than them person hanging out, having a conversation. Oh, see, this is really interesting. See, the perspective does so much storytelling. Because look at this shot versus the next shot. This is Hawkfrost talking to Brambleclaw, and he's like, hey man, let's go do this sneaky thing over here. And then we see Brambleclaw, and he's like, I'm not quite sure. This one is an upshot. We can see by the slope of Brambleclaw's head to Hawkfrost that the camera is tilted slightly upwards to look at Hawkfrost's face. Something about upshots is that they often are used to evoke power or authority. It's kind of the idea of like when you're a little kid and you're looking up at your parent. Someone who's taller than you kind of feels like they're the one in charge when you're looking up at them. And inversely, looking down at someone is like you're literally looking down at them. It can make a character feel smaller, weaker, less in authority. And so you can use upshots and downshots to give a sense of relationships or how the characters behave. And if you see here, we have this upshot right here. It's an upshot on Hawkfrost. He is the one in control of this situation. He's the one with all the power here. But if we go to the very next shot, and we trace the line from the top of Hawkfrost's head to Brambleclaw's, it's a down shot now, just very vaguely. It's just barely a down shot, and it's telling us Brambleclaw is a little bit less in control of this situation. Hawkfrost is being the brother in control in this exchange, which says stuff about their relationship and about the storytelling. And it's so subtle, and the only way you would know it is based off of where they are literally in the frame. It's at the bottom of his head, comes to here, versus the bottom of his head coming to here. So how high in the frame that your characters are can tell you really cool stuff about them. And all of this, like, see, this is so subtle. When we look closely at it, we notice it. I didn't even notice this when I was prepping the webinar. This is the first time I noticed that specific exchange, and that's why I was so excited about it. But it's all stuff that the audience picks up on instinctively. All of this makes sense because you know it in the back of your mind somewhere, is that these relationships shown through camera angles are so, over so many generations of filmmaking, we're so used to those being used to tell us something that we understand what is being told to us, even if it's not being said. Oh, and yes, the light shadow symbolism in these two shots is insane too, because he's in the light, but he's in the dark. Now all of these shots through here, oh, these are fantastic perspective-rich shots. And that's one of the best uses of perspective in a storyboard, is to be able to give a sense of environment. If you want your environments to feel like you can walk into them and be there, then they need to be in perspective to some degree. They need to, that gives you a sense of depth. It gives you a sense of space. It makes all of these boxes and carpets, all of that feels like objects you could touch. And like movies like Studio Ghibli feel so rich, and the worlds feel so lived in because the environments have this amazing sense of space. So when you're thinking about backgrounds for your parts, when you're thinking about backgrounds for your projects, think about them in terms of environments that your characters can then be in. because then the audience will feel like they're in them too. This is also a great example of using foreground objects to frame things. So here is an upshot. This one is not used to establish power, though. This one is actually storytelling based, because that's the other thing you can use. You can use the camera to establish relationships. You can also use the camera and use perspective to guide the audience into knowing what will happen next. See, right here, he jumps on here, and something comes from up above. The camera is already below him. The camera is down here looking up at him. That's why we see so much of the ceiling. The camera knows something is coming from up above him. So he gets hit with water, and then the camera moves up as both us and him look upwards. So by doing an upshot, it's guiding the audience to go, ooh, you gotta look up, you gotta look up. See, then this drip of water falls, and then it cuts to here. Now this is a down shot, which it's being used both to make him feel very small and very insignificant in the face of something really bad that's about to happen. But also this is a conversation happening. You know, we talked about how you can flip back and forth between two opposing perspectives to create a conversation. The conversation happening here is between the drip that fell on his head and the pipe. The pipe dripping on him is one character. He is the other character. This is the pipe saying something to him, and we're in Hawkfrost's perspective hearing what the pipe is saying. And then this is a point of view shot of the pipe. We are seeing what the pipe is seeing. We're looking down at Hawkfrost in the direction that the drip fell. So it pans out, or it zooms out to show that pipe that is now dripping on him. That conversation between the pipe and him. Which then cuts to here, which is an upshot. So now we are in Hawkfrost's point of view. We are seeing what Hawkfrost is seeing. The conversation continues back and forth. Now we see what he's seeing as the pipe bursts. And then back to seeing the down shot. This is the pipe's perspective. Seeing his expression change, and it's cut in real close so that we can feel that emotion that he's feeling as he panics. Because he knows what this means. And then we have this upshot where he yells to his siblings, which puts him in a place of authority, but it's also still pointing upwards because that's where the danger is coming from. We're still watching the sky to see where the water is going to be coming from. The next shot with his siblings is not looking at the sky. They aren't with Hawkfrost and us. They don't know what's happening. They're at eye level. But then it goes to this big, beautiful upshot. Now they know what's happening. And this is a great example of a tilted horizon line. So you can see here, if we trace all these lines of the pipes and the boxes that are all facing the same direction back towards this window, that puts our horizon line at somewhere about here. And it's tilted to feel like we are falling over. This is called a Dutch angle. It's when the camera is tilted to give a sense of disorientation. It kind of feels like we're about to fall over, and it gives a sense of drama to it, especially because the characters themselves are literally falling over as they rush to run away from the water. So a Dutch angle shot like this with a tilted horizon line is great for making something feel more intense, or like you have to get away, or that something bad is about to happen. It makes it feel more impactful. So you'll see it a lot with like characters approaching other characters or in the midst of a fight. Fight scenes use Dutch angles quite a bit. It's fun. And then this shot right here, this transition as the danger from the water transitions into the danger from the fox trap as Firestar is caught in the trap. This right here, this is 3-point perspective, and we know that because we can trace that all of these lines, this is where the sky plane is. We can see this Dutch angle here, that the horizon line is tilted. We can trace this peg back into space towards Brambleclaw's face, but we can also see the lines of the trees are all pointing upwards to a vanishing point somewhere up here to create 3-point perspective. And that 3-point perspective, just like the 5-point fisheye perspective, gives a stronger sense of point of view. It makes it feel more dramatic what's happening, that we are with Firestar as he's dying. Gorgeous, gorgeous camera move. So yeah, when you want an extreme sense of space and environment, 3-point is a great way to get that. Now this 3-point perspective also helps, and if you notice, Hawkfrost and Brambleclaw are really very small in the frame. There's all of this negative space around the characters where there's nothing but environment. See? Everything that's marked in red is just the environment around the characters. And what that does is having a large amount of negative space, that's what it's called when it's not a character. Anything that isn't a character is negative. Anything that is a character is positive. Or not necessarily a character, but the object that we're looking at versus the space around it. All of this negative space feels like an object that's crushing them. This is a big box of feeling that is sitting on top of these characters. The world itself is collapsing in around them with this sense of 3-point perspective to crush these two underneath it. And what it is it's all of this negative space is representing Brambleclaw's horror. It's the horror of this moment seeing Firestar dying, that this all of this space is crushing him, making him feel so small in the frame. And the audience picks that up too. And here's another example of where we can see that low horizon line because they're cats. You can see all the trees are above the horizon line because they are very tall. And because if you put a cat next to a tree, the part of the tree that would be lower than the cat's belly would be very little of it. So all of these trees are above the horizon line, while these guys stretch below it. And that's an example of how the low horizon line gives a sense of space to know that these are small characters in this space, even if the trees themselves aren't super big, because they're in the distance. Again, here's a really short horizon line because of those cats being so small. And same with here, we can see that low horizon line too, with them very high above it. And then we launch these absolutely beautiful action boards. Oh, just all of these camera moves. Here's another upshot in the POV of Hawkfrost as he's drowning, as the other kits are trying to get away, that then transitions to another Dutch angle perspective shot with a very low horizon line because of the water level. We can know because of the water that the horizon line is right here at the water line, because if you dropped your camera into a lake, the part where it could see the edge of the water would be right when the camera is at the level of the water. So the water line would be the horizon line. So because we can see this edge of the water line here, that tells us that is where the horizon line is. This is also a great animatic if you want an example of really great fight scene choreography and transitions using the camera moves. Highly recommend it. Here's another upshot. Now we're in order to see Tadpole rescuing Hawkfrost. which this is great. The upshot here is because we are in Hawkfrost's point of view. Even though we're not seeing what he's seeing, we are in the water. This is our horizon line. Well, technically it's a Dutch angle, so the horizon line is right there. But we see that edge of the water, which means if we were a little kitten in the water next to them, we would also be right here at the edge of the water looking at these two. So it puts us in the shoes of the characters and makes us feel like we're right there with them. Which that's another thing to think about when choosing what perspectives you want your shots from, is like, where do you want your audience in relative to the character? Do you want the audience to feel far away, like they're looking at the character in the distance, feeling sorry for them, feeling judgmental of them? Do we want to be feeling what the character is feeling? Then we want to be right next to them with our arm around them, feeling their feelings. And so the perspective of a shot and where you put the characters within it can also help articulate to the audience what we want to be feeling or who we're rooting for. So right here, we're really rooting for these two to not drown. And same here, we're through all these shots, we're sticking with those two and their perspectives. Here, it's a down shot because we're seeing what their mom is seeing up above as she's looking through the window. Or I guess it's still Moth Kid at that point, looking down from the window. Yep, there's Moth Kid, there's Mom, Sasha. And this is a great POV shot. This is a literal POV shot. We're seeing through Tadpole's eyes as he falls into the water. And then this beautiful low horizon transition down. And see, this is another example of an upshot. This one is definitely meant to convey power because Hawkfrost is literally pushing Brambleclaw down out of frame with his paw on his back, being like, I won this fight. I'm the one in power here. I'm the one who says what goes. But then it's interesting because this is a shot of power, of aggression, of saying, I'm in charge, I'm going to win this fight, you are going to get stopped, and it immediately transitions to the same upshot, same perspective. Except now he's in a point, not of power, but of weakness as he's being pulled away from the camera. Because this shot, this perspective, is Tadpole's perspective as Tadpole is drowning after he was... as he was slipping into the water. So it takes this point of aggression and then makes it a point of weakness, which then implies a relationship. Putting these two shots back to back, he's acting out of anger because of the time that he felt weakness, because of the time he lost his brother. And this is just a beautiful down shot, which we can tell because of the slope of these boxes. We know that this is all going in to a vanishing point right about there. And then Tadpole falls down, drowns, and then it goes to the same down shot, the same perspective of him looking at his other brother, Brambleclaw, that he's about to kill. So then now he created an association between all those shots, between his love for Tadpole and his brotherly love for Brambleclaw. Again, this is an upshot, but it's specifically an upshot from Brambleclaw's perspective. If he were to flip over, what would he see? That's a good tip for when you're picking your shots, is just who is the camera? Because a lot of times if you just say the camera is a specific person in the scene, then you're doing pretty good. And then this action shot, super low horizon, so that we can be right next to this fox trap as he grabs it. And then as he gets in. So yeah, so you can kind of see throughout that. It was mostly upshots, downshots, and conversation shots, as well as some establishing shots where you could see the top and bottom. And usually when I'm doing a board, that's what I use too. It boils down to just that. So yeah, go watch Third Planet by Nikihi and if you can snag the video and scrub through it like this to see how they're doing some of those transitions and some of those moves, you'll learn a lot from it. Whew, we're getting close to the end of the webinar. This has been really fun. I hope it has made some sense. So now last thing I really want to talk about before we get to the last Q&A is some of the like shorthand I use when I'm doing perspectives in boards. So, if I were to board a shot, I would not do an entire perspective grid like this. That would take a lot of time, and as a board artist, you got to work fast when you're working on storyboards, because you just need it to tell your artists enough so that they know what they need to draw. So what I usually do is, if I know I'm going to have two characters facing off in a fight scene, so let's draw a character here in the foreground. MH asks, will this be available afterwards? Yes, this recording will be available under my live videos forever, so you can go watch it once it's done. So we've got an angry cat here, and I want there to be an angry cat that he's looking at, because we're going to do a fight scene. So now I know vaguely that I want this to be a down shot, because then we could see this whole character as they're about to fight. It also kind of puts us in a position where we are watching the fight but are more neutral parties. So I know vaguely from just the direction that these heads are that the perspective grid is going to look something like that. So usually when I'm doing a storyboard, I will just draw something like that, and I'll just very roughly approximate that grid. Now if I look at it and I go, that doesn't look quite right, I want it to be more of a down shot, I'll just grab the whole grid and I'll squish it. If you squish a grid up, it'll lift the camera so that we're looking down at it, because we're seeing more of it. Remember the circle that was getting squishier the closer it was to the horizon line? We can now squish and unsquish a perspective grid to make it feel like we're closer to the horizon line. So see, I squished that with the transform tool, and now the horizon line is really low. Now we're at almost cat level for this fight scene. And because of that, I dropped the character so that they could feel like they're standing on the same thing. Another shorthand I'll do in order to do this, if I really want to get specific with the perspective grid, is I will make a literal grid like this, not in perspective. This is just a grid. And then some software will have this tool. It's either called the skew tool, SKEW, so you know to look it up. It's also often called the perspective tool. It's usually an option available under a lot of softwares as a variety of the transform tool. Under Storyboard Pro, it's the second little icon right here under perspective tool. And what it does is it lets you transform an image specifically by moving each end to squish it, which means I can very specifically squish it to make it a perspective thing, and I can move them closer to the vanishing point or farther away from the vanishing point. And I can squish that to be what I need it to be. And if I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is nice, but the lines in the grid are going backwards, so it's as if I'm standing next to this fight scene, but I'm looking off behind it. So if, for example, you wanted to have a fight scene in the foreground, but an important character in the back watching it, and you wanted your audience to focus on that, then this would be a great perspective grid. But because I want the audience to feel like they are with this cat about to fight, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this perspective grid and I'm going to squish it. I'm just going to bend it like a rhombus, and just skew it to go that direction, which Storyboard Pro is really good at skewing. So that's why I like it. And I can just tilt that there into that shape of the rhombus. And there you go. Now you know what else this sort of transforming a flat grid is good for? This is going to blow your minds. This guy right here is casting a shadow that looks something like this. I can now skew that, and if I take it over here, I can actually make the box of the transform tool match the perspective grid that I have. See that, how I'm making the edges match the line? And now his shadow's in perspective. And that works really well for shadows, for reflections. I've done that for like putting, if a character is looking like into a mirror to show what they are looking at, or if they're looking into a pond, I've done that a lot. Because we know in perspective that you can just squish the square and bend it into a rhombus or a parallelogram, and it will put it into perspective. Dreamer says, my brain doesn't comprehend why the angled to the side grid is more accurate. The reality is it isn't more accurate, but it feels more accurate because, remember, everything is a box. If these two characters facing each other were boxes, see, there's the box where like the paw on one end is one corner, the paw on the other is another corner. See, that's another great tip, is everything is a box. A cat's 4 paws straight on the ground form a box, forms a square, or at least a rectangle, which is a great way to put it into perspective. Then these two cats are facing each other, which means they are parallel to each other, which means they're going back into perspective at the same angle, which is the tilted angle there. And that's why that side grid feels better, is because it's actually pointing now to the same vanishing point that these two characters have. It's literally all boxes. It's all boxes all the way down. Always has been. So I have one other shorthand that I use for when it comes to foreshortening. Foreshortening is specifically putting things into perspective when they are facing the same direction the camera is, which can be really tricky because, you know, that when things get closer to the camera, they get bigger. But if it's a character that's getting closer to the camera with part of it, but part of it is far away, then like it can get really confusing if you have a character like reaching out. Touching me, touching you, sweet Caroline, ba ba ba. So see, that's in perspective. It's very approximate perspective though, and foreshadowing is something that becomes a lot easier with a lot of practice and a lot of reference to know exactly how big to make the part in the foreground, how big to make the part in the middle, and how to connect it so it looks right. But if you look here, one tip, these are parallel lines. They're going to converge towards a vanishing point. It's a cylinder. I do have one tip for drawing something like this that I use to often approximate foreshortening, especially when it comes to limbs on characters, and that is spirals. See, if you have an arm, here's an arm. If you were to wrap a piece of string around the arm in a spiral, it would look kind of like that. But we know if we're looping around the arm that the front of the arm is a circle, vaguely, because our arms are cylinders, they're round. So each of these loops around the arm is going to be a circle, which means if you draw something like this, that each level of the spiral is coming closer towards the camera. So like if I wanted to draw a football is kind of the easiest one to demonstrate this, you know. Here's a football, there's the spiral that encapsulates the football. If I draw smaller spirals that get into a bigger one and then taper it off, football in perspective. Or if it's an arm reaching towards the camera, parallel line, wrist, shoulder. It's just that the smallest circle is going to be where it connects to the arm, and the biggest circle is where it connects to the hand. So this one would have a very big hand attached because that's a very wide wrist, and then a very small body attached because the shoulder is pretty big. But drawing a little spiral can help you get a sense for the shape of a noodle or a cylinder when it's a weird organic cylinder moving through space. And that's just a little shorthand I like to use. It's very imprecise, but it helps you get a feel for it. So foreshortening is something I also have not mastered, but when you do master it, you can end up with some really cool, really dynamic shots that just make things feel cool. So that was really the last thing I wanted to talk about before heading into the Q&A. So does anyone have any other questions relative to drawing things in perspective or perspective in shots and the things that they can do? And I'll just wait a little bit because I know that there's a lag between the YouTube chat and me actually seeing it pop up on my end. And if I'm just sitting here quietly for a minute or two and no one has any questions, then feel free to be like, no one has any questions, you're good. Dreamer Seeker asks, is the best way to learn just to like do it a bunch? Maybe study other works and try to find perspectives too? 100%. Take a look at things that do it well. I would recommend taking movies you like and taking shots that you like in a movie and drawing over them to see how the perspective works in a different shot by taking things that are the same height or pointing the same direction and tracing them back to the vanishing point. You could also take pieces of famous art. That's a very classic one, is to find pictures of famous art online and trace back the perspective on those. I like doing studies of manga panels sometimes because manga will often have really beautiful perspective shots in them, especially when they're set in like cities. City shots are great for learning perspective because buildings all are parallel boxes because they all sit parallel on a street. If they didn't, they would look crooked. So finding city shots, you can get some really cool perspective there too. Go out, take photos, use Minecraft like we talked about earlier. Which Tumble did bring up Minecraft right now, that Minecraft perspective is really weird. That's because Minecraft perspective is a very zoomed out 3-point perspective. Like, it's actually a little bit fisheye if you actually look at it, which is pretty wild. So experiment in Minecraft anyway, and see what you can come up with for references. Dead Hour Judge says drawing cities is the worst though. But see, Dead Hour Judge, this is going to empower you because cities are just boxes. They're just lots of boxes. And the windows are all just boxes. And once you know how to put them into perspective, you will have all the power and you will be a god. Coalfox asked, tips on drawing living creatures in perspective. Cats do not want to be boxes for me. Haha. It helps a lot to break down the shapes of what you're trying to draw in perspective. So for example, if we look at a cat has a sphere for a head, or it has kind of a flat box for a head. If you look at a cat, and then have a little bit of a box here for the muzzle, and then you have some cones for the ears. Something that can help is to look at how other people draw simplified form cats and see some of the planes that are happening, some of the shapes they're making. Probably the best reference of all for drawing living creatures in perspective, though, is to find reference. Yeah, usually when I draw a cat in perspective, I'm thinking about the head, which is a sphere, which means it has circles in perspective. And then the body is another circle, or better yet, a cylinder in perspective. And then I know there's a box on the ground underneath them, which is where their legs are, because the 4 points where they put their little paws form a square in perspective. And then, of course, the tail is also a cylinder, but that one's a little easier to be noodly about. But yeah, getting reference shots of things you want to draw, whether it's photos online, or if you can take your own photos of animals or other organic things, or if you can't take photos of them, if it's not a real thing like a dragon or a crazy sword, then see if you can make an approximation of it in clay. Get some Sculpey, make a little clay model, or if you have a kneaded eraser, turn the kneaded eraser into a little sculpture. Squish it around, and then take photos of it in different camera angles that you want. Oh, Irhanus says you can adjust the FOV in Minecraft, which would change the perspective that's visible and where the vanishing points go. So that's another thing to experiment with. MH says, I'm currently working on a very war-heavy with humans PMV. Are there some pretty universal unsettling angles that you'd recommend incorporating? There's no real general, like, super firm, like, rule on cool shots to use, but if it's something that's war-heavy, I would recommend looking at other videos that depict war and see what kind of shots they use. I know horror will often use a lot of down shots and a lot of tilted Dutch angle shots, because the tilted Dutch angle makes things feel unsettling, yet like you're about to fall over, and the down shots make the characters feel small and scared, like the whole world is crushing them in. Or if you're going to do an upshot, putting the characters down at the base of the frame and doing an upshot that makes the whole negative space of the environment around them feel like it's crushing them. Play around with different angles and drawing the same thing from different perspectives and see what you like best. See what feels right. And the more you draw, the more you'll get a better sense for what feels right and for what feels the way you want it to feel. And again, find books or art or movies or TV shows that feel the way you want your work to feel, and see how they're doing that with perspective or with anything else. Carrie Smith asks, came in late, so I don't know if it was already covered, but tips on doing circles in perspective. I can't quite seem to get the curves right, and they end up coming out more like rounded squares. I would recommend just drawing a lot of ovals, Carrie. They are all ovals. I'll show you. I did a little doodle earlier in the webinar. Let's go back to it. Let me find it. Whoops. Where's the... Here we go. The closer a circle gets to the horizon line, the more squished it'll be, and it'll just be an oval. So try drawing a stack of circles like this, where the circle gets progressively more squished. And you can do that by just copy and pasting a literal circle. Copy it, paste, squish it a little, drop it below. Copy, paste, squish it a little, drop it below. And keep doing that until you get it down to like just a line. And then go the other way of squishing it down so that it becomes round again. Which I guess that would actually be my full tip, is to put a circle in perspective, just squish it with the transform tool into an oval. Squished. And then if it's not flat on the ground, then turn it. Perspective. Tumble on Discord made a perspective grid using red and black blocks in Minecraft, which is honestly really, really cool. Tumble, is there a way that I could link the seed for that or something in the description of the webinar so that anyone who has Minecraft could copy it? I've never tried using other people's builds in Minecraft before, so I'm not sure. Yeah, if you can make the world files available and send those to me, Tumble, I would love to put those in the description as well, so anyone who uses Minecraft could use them as a baseline for creating reference in perspective. That would be super cool. I will set that up. I don't know how long that'll take me to do, but I'll set that up so that is also linked in the description of this webinar. All right, any other questions before we call it the end and wrap up? I'm hoping to do other webinars like this. I'd like to do one more about composition, about where to put something in a frame for interesting storytelling. So I'll take a look. I'll ask around and see what y'all would like to learn about for the next webinar. And I'd like to do more of these because they're pretty fun and I like sharing information. That's the best gift you can give, is sharing cool stuff you learn. When it comes to art, that is. Bugsy, about how many known perspectives are there? I have no idea. But if you Google it, I bet you could find out. Although be careful, Google has been answering weird results of late, I hear. But that is definitely a question that would probably exist in one of many books that I have not read myself. Well, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous coming in. I am really glad that this made sense and that this could be helpful for you all. And I hope you can pass it forward and make amazing art and put it all in perspective, because perspective is cool and fun, and take lots of photos of cool perspective things. Once you start to see perspective, you're going to see it everywhere and it's hilarious. You'll just be looking at things and be like, oh my gosh, converging lines. So I'm really glad y'all all could make it. Thank you so much for the great questions and for the great feedback. Have a lot of fun making lots of cool art. I believe in all of y'all, and I can't wait to see what you all make. Good luck, take care, and have a lovely rest of your night. Bye-bye!